welcome back to the Government Transformation Show, a podcast for public sector changemakers. I'm your host, Sam Birchall, and today I'm joined by Alex Jaimes, who is Chief Scientist and SVP of Artificial Intelligence at Dataminr. So we have a really interesting, very enlightening conversation about operationalizing AI, and Alex talks a bit about where he's seeing some of the biggest opportunities for AI to transform the public sector, how government departments can take advantage of this technology and move forward on it, starting by separating the hype from the reality. I really enjoyed this conversation and there's lots to dig into, so let's jump in. Hi Alex, welcome to the Government Transformation Show. Great to have you on the podcast today. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Really excited to talk to you about operationalizing AI, particularly how and where it's sort of paving the way for improved and more efficient services in the public sector and how best to continue maximizing the use of this technology. Really interesting topic, so really keen to delve into that. But first, let's start with some intros. So maybe just tell us a bit about what you do at Dataminr, kind of what's your role, your area of expertise, and why this particular topic's important to you.
Yeah, so I've been at Dataminr for almost 5 years now, and I lead all of our AI efforts, both in engineering and in applied research. So basically, my teams are in charge of creating models that detect events that are used by government agencies and corporations for emergency response and corporate risk. All kinds of events all over the world. And we process over 500,000 data sources 24/7 from all over the world. So it's images, video, text, audio, sensor data from many different platforms, including social media, dark web, sensor data, different languages, different formats. So there's tons and tons of data that the platform needs to process to detect events that are important for emergency response and for other use cases, including cyber. So my team is in charge of a lot of the AI that detects these events and generates the summaries that describe exactly what the event was, so that first responders can reach those locations faster and save lives.
Yeah, cool. And I'm really keen to kind of maybe delve into a few of those examples a bit later. But first, just to set the scene, because I feel like AI, it seems, is really the talk of the town at the moment. We know it has the ability to significantly transform government processes and how it can change how services are delivered. And I think we're certainly seeing the number and complexity of developments in this space is really increasing. Curious to get, I guess, kind of what your take on the current state of AI in government is right now in terms of the kind of maturity you're seeing in how AI is implemented? Yeah,
it's a tough question because I think, different governments have different approaches to AI, and it's apples and oranges. Some governments are a bit more advanced than others in terms of regulation and adoption and how they think about AI and how they're using it. So there's a pretty wide spectrum. And to be frank, things in industry are moving so quickly that even without the fast pace, it's traditionally been hard for governments to keep up with technology and to be using the latest and the greatest in some areas, not in all of them, obviously. So I think it really depends on where you look, which government it is and what it is that they're doing. But I've seen in general, a lot of progress in how AI is used across the board, and many more concerns, in part because now it's more prevalent, it's everywhere, and people are more aware that it is, even though it's been around for a long time. But in the last almost 10 years, there's been a pretty significant increase in visibility of the work and more advanced techniques, which have made some of the applications more feasible, both for industry and government. And of course, things have really exploded since November of last year in terms of hype and potential. But I think there's a lot of work to do, both in industry and depends on the industry, and also in government.
Yeah, I feel like it's one of those, it's almost, you can't kind of afford not to engage with it anymore. We've kind of reached that inflection point where there's no going back. You kind of have to have some kind of strategy or kind of some kind of plan of action around how best to use it. But kind of, I guess, delving a bit more into that, but keen to get your thoughts on where some of the biggest areas or kind of big areas of opportunity are for AI. So I think one of the more common trends we're seeing is how AI is being used to automate more routine tasks and processes within departments. And the value of being, of course, is that it frees up civil servants' time for more complex and value-added work. Could you talk us through maybe a bit more about how this works and how you're seeing the opportunities in that space?
So in general, AI is based on learning patterns from data. And so anywhere where you have repetitive patterns and you can make predictions where those predictions are useful, those are areas in which you would apply AI, and that's essentially what it does. So lots of data, repetitive patterns where you can make predictions that are useful. When you think of it from that perspective, there are tons and tons of applications, both in industry and government. And arguably, many processes in government are repetitive, as they are in industry. There are kind of two branches of AI, and the techniques are pretty much the same or very similar. One is predictive AI, and the other one is generative AI. Predictive AI basically consists of techniques that make predictions. They don't necessarily make predictions about the future. They just predict labels or classifications for things. So they classify stuff, they label stuff, right? And generative AI generates content. And so when we see some of the more recent AI advances generating fancy images and interesting text and so on and so forth, that's the generative part. The predictive part would do things like just classify tasks and label things. So when you look at it from that perspective, I think most of the applications of AI in government would probably be on the detection side, on the predictive area, but there will be also quite a few on the generative side, more in terms of how they can be used in chatbots, for instance, and in some cases in generating summaries and pointing people to information. So on the labeling, there's tons of data that is public and that governments own as well. And as this data increases and will continue to increase, and interestingly, in part because of the generative AI techniques becoming more useful and prevalent across the board, that means there will be more and more data being generated and more information generated. And that means governments have a bigger challenge in detecting what's important and what's not, and summarizing what's important and gathering statistics. As you know, one of the things that governments need to do continuously is collect statistics and understand what's going on so they can make policies around what's happening. So a lot of it is based on data, right? And so when you think of it from that perspective, the ability to collect data, to extract information that is useful, and obtain observations that are useful for policy making, that's important, and that's an area where AI can help. Another area would be when it comes to government, there are many regulations. There's a lot of information that different agencies have. It's sometimes in silos, or I would say often in silos. And citizens need access to that information, and it's often hard for them to get it. And even for government employees, it's sometimes difficult to understand, what something means or where the information is. So search has always been an important application, and AI has been used in search traditionally. But recent advances in chatbots allow perhaps sort of what people are using in customer service, where you have chatbots that could help government employees get information faster so that they can answer questions from citizens, and perhaps citizens as well. This is kind of cutting edge in the sense that some of these techniques require quite a bit of additional work to put the right safeguards in place and guardrails so that the chatbot doesn't go off the rails and starts talking about something that is irrelevant or giving false information. But if you're looking for something around, say, healthcare, something related to regulation, a chatbot could potentially point you to the right document. And by pointing you to specific documents, instead of just giving you an answer, we could mitigate the risks of the chatbot giving you something that is not accurate. But it could definitely speed up access to information, make it easier for people to engage. And again, for government employees to collect that information, then convey it to citizens. And then in terms of the predictions and classification, any process where there's a lot of data and things need to be repeated, and predictions can be made and can be useful. So that can lower costs and make things more efficient. And you can think of almost anything in that space. And sort of that area has been around for a long time in terms of AI. There's been work in AI to do predictions for a very long time. So lots of opportunities.
Keen to get a sense of where you what some of the biggest challenges and pain points there are for government departments in operationalizing AI? So what's standing in the way? And are these challenges more cultural, more technical? Yeah, where do you see those key pain points, I guess?
Yeah, so I think there are multiple challenges when it comes to making this a reality in a government or a government agency. One of them is education and making sure that the stakeholders across the board understand what AI is, what it does, when it succeeds, when it fails, what the risks are, what it takes to actually build AI and deploy it successfully and monitor it so that it does what it's supposed to, and so on and so forth. And, that can go all the way from the president of the country all the way down to the engineers building it. I was fortunate enough to be part of the expert mission on AI for the Colombian government.
Oh, wow.
And I was told that the president, Duque, the previous president, forced his entire cabinet to do an AI course,
Oh, wow.
which was pretty impressive. And, they understood a lot of the concept, the basic concepts. It didn't mean they needed to code or anything of that sort, but understanding, what's doable, what's not, is important. And that's often one limitation. The second one is data. Access to data, as I said before, sometimes it's in silos. And so you need a data strategy and you need a cohesive view on how the data may be used with all the protections to make sure privacy is preserved, et cetera, et cetera. So getting access to data is really critical for AI systems, for building AI systems, and sometimes governments and companies as well that are not what you would call digital natives. They're not that good at making their data available for the scientists that are building these AI systems, or the engineers building them. So education, data, then the skill sets and the people to actually build them. That's another potential limitation where sometimes governments lag a little bit behind in hiring the right talent. And so that's a key area, hiring people with expertise that have some experience and ideally that at the top have significant experience in building teams and building these ecosystems, because unlike traditional software, when you're building AI, you do things differently. There's a lot more experimentation. You have to monitor the models that you deploy. Once they've been deployed, you have to test them beforehand. With traditional software, you kind of know exactly what you're going to do, and you build it. You kind of build the time frame. You allocate resources, and you build it and you deploy it. And in some ways, you're done. I mean, you're not really done, but you're kind of done once you do that. With AI, the cycle is quite different. There's more experimentation. And so it does require a different skill set, and it requires perspectives that are more open to experiments. And obviously, when it's governments running these experiments, they have to be as careful or more careful than corporations in making sure that the AI does what it's supposed to.
Yeah.
So those are just some of the few challenges that governments have. The other one that I forgot to mention is the organizational structure. How are things set up? Who owns the data? As I said, one of the problems is often it's in silos, because maybe one agency has data that's useful but doesn't share it with another agency, even if it's public. So it's hard for government entities to share that data. Sometimes organizational changes within government can have a big impact in how that's done. And then maybe the last one is computing infrastructure. One thing that has happened in industry over the last several years or decades has been the move to the cloud, where you can efficiently run processes on potentially thousands of computers just off of a laptop, and you're essentially renting compute. That makes it very easy to scale. When you need a lot of compute power, you use it immediately. You pay only for what you use. When you don't need it, you reduce what you use and you only pay for what you're using. And that's a very powerful paradigm, because it allows you to scale when demand is high, scale down when it's low. And traditionally, governments have shied away from doing this because of concerns around data privacy and so on and so forth. But adopting a cloud-based ecosystem definitely makes things faster, easier, particularly in the AI space. And we've seen quite a bit of progress in that sense, in governments moving towards cloud-based solutions. And then obviously when you do that, you often end up collaborating more with industry as well, because there are companies that offer services through APIs or through other means can be accessed through the same cloud providers.
Yeah, all really interesting points, Alex. I think it's particularly interesting that point about the AI kind of capabilities and the government that you said that had kind of said, well, everyone here has to have specific AI training is perhaps quite a good way to go, maybe just to give people that base level understanding of it. Because I think that's partly it, is people kind of have these preconceived notions about what it is and maybe don't quite understand just how helpful it can be. So yeah, definitely some interesting points highlighted there. Another question I wanted to ask you about was, I think you've kind of hinted at it in a few of your answers, but it's this whole question around kind of the ethical considerations around AI. So kind of what precautions, I guess, can be taken to ensure that AI applications are developed and deployed in a way that respects individual privacy and autonomy, and that they don't kind of perpetuate these biases or discrimination.
Yeah, so there are quite a few. I think, it's pretty clear that regulation is needed, because in many cases companies don't know exactly what the right thing is.
Yeah.
And so regulation helps make sure that there's consistency across the board. And obviously there are many different use cases for AI and how it is applied. And it really does depend a lot on the application. And there's already regulation around AI in the United States, for instance, around the financial sector and healthcare, right? And it's because traditionally, governments have found that there are some potential risks in deploying certain types of algorithms in that space. As AI becomes more widely adopted and the use cases become larger and larger and more diverse, it becomes a bit harder to do that. But in general, I would say that most technologists and most companies really do try hard to ensure that the work they do, is deployed in a responsible way. And we certainly do. And so you look at, things like, what is the actual application? How is it going to be used? And there are many ways of kind of overseeing that. One is obviously, the legal framework under which your users can use the technology that you're providing. Another one is the limitations that you have on your product to make sure that it's not used in one way or another. The risks vary depending on the application. One of them is obviously, that they can reinforce existing biases that they find in their training data. So I mentioned before that all of these methods are based on training and lots of data. So if you feed them data that is biased, then the models will make biased decisions, right? So you have to pay attention to the data that you're using during training and the task that the model is going to perform. And there's a big difference between, a model making a decision on something versus a model detecting something, right? So it depends on the kind of model and what exactly it is doing. That's one. With more recent advances in AI, one of the other risks is hallucinations, which I'm sure many people who will watch this have seen or heard about. And basically, because these systems are based on very large amounts of training data, and they're making predictions based on that data, they basically are like statistical machines that are predicting, in the simplest form, just the next word of a sentence. And that can be extended, that concept can be extended to images and to more complex scenarios where the next word is actually the next sentence in a conversation, and so on and so forth. And the way they're built, they kind of try to complete the sentence as well as possible. And so statistically, what that might mean sometimes is that they make things up that are not necessarily true. And that is one of the biggest risks for some of the applications. When you have, I mentioned earlier the use case of having a chatbot, sort of like customer support for a government agency, so that a citizen can go in and chat with this bot and ask for information. There is a risk that the chatbot will make up information and say, yeah, you can do this, or you can't do that, or this is how you get this is how you apply for this particular government benefit. And it turns out that it's completely wrong. It doesn't exist. So that's bad, right? You wouldn't want that. So one of the ways to mitigate that would be to make sure that when you're deploying such a model, first you make sure you're feeding it the right training data. So in the example that I gave, for instance, you may want to make sure that it's really using only or mostly the data that is going to need to answer the questions that it should be answering. right? So that if you ask the chatbot questions about, good recipes, it wouldn't answer you. It would say, this is outside of what I do, but I'm happy to help you, get access to this particular government benefit. And then the second way is and there are technical ways of doing this. The second way is to limit the kinds of answers that it gives you, so that instead of just giving you a long form textual answer, it can maybe give you a short summary, but point you to the part of the document or to the place where you actually apply. And I do think that over time, these guardrails will get better. In some cases, it's still hard to build them and to do them effectively, but they will get better. At the same time, I think that people in general will need to get better at understanding those limitations of these AI systems, and to not take everything at face value when they're interacting with these AI systems.
Yeah,
but there's a lot of work in the technical community in building techniques to mitigate those risks. But ultimately, it is very application dependent, and people tend to lump it all into one. AI is dangerous, AI is safe, and it's really a spectrum, because it really depends exactly on where it's being deployed, what it's doing, what the training data is, what the models are. And when you look at that whole spectrum, there are many places where you can have checkpoints. And as I said at the beginning, one of the challenges with AI is because it's not deterministic, meaning that the models take an input and then generate an output, whether it's a label or not, because they're working with new data often that they did not see during training. It's not always possible to predict with 100% certainty what the output of these models is going to be. That's why they're non-deterministic. And because of that, they require additional safeguards. And one of those is making sure that they do what they're supposed to once they're deployed. So there's a difference in the deployment process and how the software is developed as opposed to traditional software.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, it does seem to all come back to that kind of educational point about, it's the public as well to understand kind of the nuances of AI, which I think a lot of us are still kind of coming to terms with. But no, interesting to see kind of where perhaps in the future chatbots might be used in more public services. I don't know. It seems like it's a bit risky at the moment.
It is.
Space to watch. But curious now, I guess, how can the public sector really move forward on AI deployment? So what do they really need to be successful in operationalizing it and getting the most value of it?
I think, I would say it's not too different from companies that are not sort of AI first. And usually when companies move into using AI, they start with, well, one way is obviously, using input from vendors or using services that AI companies provide and integrating those into their workflows. That is one effective way of doing it. The other one is to focus initially on the low-hanging fruits, and very often the low-hanging fruits are tasks that are cost-saving tasks that are kind of more mundane and easier to automate, where the risk is low. So I mentioned before, the risks vary depending on the application, right? And so depending on the application, there are different levels of risks. And so you can take within that application and determine, where the risks are low and where they're high. So for instance, if you're applying for a driver's license, you could have a chatbot that helps you figure out what you need, or you want to apply for passport, and sometimes the instructions are a bit confusing. Having a chatbot that helps you figure out, what you need to apply for a passport, maybe that's not too high risk. It has to be done properly so it doesn't exclude people from certain populations or education levels, right? And so in that case, it might actually help provide better access. If you're going to use it in healthcare, the risk is higher, because then, again, depending on what you're doing in healthcare, maybe if it's an insurance claim, it's not as high as if it's anything related to healthcare advice. So I think part of the trick is kind of looking at the spectrum of possibilities, where you have, again, repetitive patterns where you can make predictions, where those predictions are useful, or where the generation part, which is often now can be thought of as conversational agents or search tasks, and then identifying within that domain what are the low risk versus the medium and high risk applications, and then kind of identifying where the biggest gains will be made. So it's not so different from how you would make an investment in a technology project, except that often with AI, the outcomes are less clear. But as more people and more companies and more governments adopt these technologies, one effective way of doing this is keeping an eye out on what everyone else is doing. And when you say, hey, they did it this way and it worked, so we can do it, or they did it this way and it didn't work, so let's not do that. So sharing of information and knowledge I think is going to be pretty important. And this is happening today quite significantly in the technical community with a lot of the open source and how to build the models, how to make them safer, how to make them better, how they behave, et cetera, et cetera.
And I guess speaking of sharing the knowledge, do you have any kind of examples of best practice in using AI? So can we take any lessons from particular governments, countries, or even from the private sector, kind of on how best to implement this technology? If there's anything that springs to mind at all?
I think the ethical issues and the responsible AI principles are ones that should be taken into account from day one, and they should be considered across the board. And that includes, the people building the models. So that's important, because when you're building the models, you're actually looking at data, you are making a lot of decisions that can have an impact. So that's one, so I think, taking that into account. The second one is, as I said before, making sure you build processes around access to data and tasks, that you measure things in terms of what matters. So you use the right metrics to answer the right questions, and you apply them in the right places. One of the mistakes that people often make with AI is they kind of go on one of two extremes. They either think that it's magic, do anything, or that it's too complicated and that the company or government agency or government are not ready to do it. And it's usually not that binary. There's a spectrum of things in between. And so having a better understanding of where it can be applied and what can be useful, and where the low-hanging fruits are, where the risks are, where it can be beneficial, are critical. So I think, in summary, some of the things that I said at the beginning in terms of, having the stakeholders believe and support that it's going to be useful, and start sometimes with smaller projects, paying a lot of attention to the data, the metrics, performance of the models, ethics, and how it's going to be deployed responsibly, and the impact of that deployment, how it will be used, how it's trained, et cetera, et cetera.
I know someone said something quite interesting to me the other day when we were talking about AI, and it was about kind of how when it's implemented, or kind of when it's eventually fully implemented into the public sector, there's the kind of element of empathy that is lost, that people actually turn to, especially when they're trying to speak to civil servants or government. So be curious to see kind of how that evolves, and whether we are kind of, when we implement this kind of AI into a lot of our services, whether that empathy, kind of loss of empathy maybe will have a negative impact on stuff. But
it's interesting, because it could be the opposite. There have been studies that have shown that people tend to trust AI more than they trust humans. There is a study, and I'm forgetting exactly where this was done, where they had a robot help people evacuate from a fire, and people trusted the robot, even though the robot in one case was taking them into the fire.
Wow.
And there have been other studies that show that, in chatbot sort of interactions, people start kind of trusting these chatbots, and in some ways not necessarily developing feelings for them. Although some studies have been done as well with like toy robots, where if the robot expresses emotions and the users are instructed to switch them off, and the robot expresses emotions, say like, please don't switch me off, humans are less likely to switch them off, even though they know that these robots don't have any emotions. And that's actually one of the risks. People start believing these chatbots more than they do humans. But I think if used appropriately, they can actually increase empathy, especially towards government services, where the government is really trying to reach out to people and do things that will benefit them. So I think it's not clear yet, how that's going to go, but I think there's potential for a lot of good stuff.
No, that's interesting.
As well as some risks.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to hear that. I guess I haven't really thought about it from that perspective, but interesting, kind of, can AI perhaps build more trust in government? There's an interesting thought, but curious as well to hear a bit about how Dataminr can help with operationalizing AI. So perhaps, is there any kind of projects or case studies that you're able to talk about that you've worked on to kind of highlight in this case?
Well, I guess at multiple levels. As a business, what we do is we detect events in public data, and we send out alerts about those events. And the events range from small traffic accidents all the way up to fires, hurricanes, COVID-19, market moves, political statements, and anything that's newsworthy for the public sector, for corporate risk, and for news and journalism. And that includes cyber threats and cybersecurity, et cetera, et cetera. So at that level, and this is what I mentioned earlier, sometimes the best answer to what's needed is actually engaging with a company that provides the services, right? Building something like what we've built is hard. It takes hundreds of millions of dollars in investment because of the data sources. Even though they're public, it doesn't mean that they're free. We actually have to pay for a lot of that data to have access to it. It's all public. So it's expensive to build from the data perspective. There's huge amounts of data, a lot of compute is needed, a lot of expertise. And so in many cases, and this is similar with the corporate world, you don't need to build everything yourself. There are many scenarios where you're better off just using a service, right? So for something like this, if there's a company that's providing these events that are useful for different use cases, instead of building it yourself, you're better off probably just using best-in-class service. In terms of what we do as a company to help other organizations kind of get up to speed, we talk about what we do openly, like I'm doing today, often with government partners. We tell them about experiences we've had building AI and go into more detail around hiring and building teams and how do you ensure that the data is not in silos and so on and so forth. And then we do have some open programs as well. We recently launched an AI for Good program where NGOs and other entities can participate, where they submit a proposal for an AI for Good project, and they work directly with our scientists to find a solution to that problem. We did one of those recently with the UN Office of Human Rights, where we helped them build a system to detect threats to human rights defenders in public data, in news articles, so they can track and gather statistics, which helps them influence policies in different countries. And so that's one specific program, in addition to what I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, some really cool examples there. Thanks for sharing those, Alex. And I like to sort of finish off the podcast by sort of having a forward-looking, future-looking question. So I'd love to know, Alex, what some of the exciting trends in AI coming down the line are, and are there still areas where the potential of AI remains untapped within the public sector?
Yeah, there are so many areas where it remains untapped, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector as well. As I said before, I think one of the exciting things about AI for government is, I think on one hand, many government decisions should be, or ideally would be made based on data and statistics. And AI has shown a lot of promise in gathering useful broad population data that can be used to make decisions. So that's one area which I think is interesting and is important. Like, for example, census are expensive to conduct. They're done every 10, 15, 20 years. It's very hard to get accurate data. Other techniques have been found to be as effective in collecting some of that information that using AI. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there in just collecting information that can be used to determine things. In healthcare, public health, there are many opportunities. And again, it's based on data, population level data, not looking at individual data. So a lot of statistic-based policy making opportunities. I think the other one I mentioned before, I think in general, most governments really want to be effective and efficient in the services they provide, but they often struggle, which is why they often subcontract companies to do that, like, to apply for visas or to get your driver's license or, whatever that is. So there are a lot of opportunities to make processes more efficient and to make access to citizens more efficient, faster, and easier to understand. One of the challenges with government is the data is often very confusing. When you need any kind of service, there are a lot of sources. You often don't even know which agency you need to go to. When you do find it, the information is written in language that's hard to understand, even for the most educated. And so I think potentially, chatbot technology, which has advanced pretty significantly, at least in the last couple of years, could be very useful in helping citizens better understand that information and get what they need faster. This leads to services, right? And clearly, if you do this faster and better, it provides better access to things. I read a story in the New York Times recently about how in many countries births are not properly recorded yet, and when that doesn't happen, the people that are born, the babies that then become adults, if they end up not having health access, they can't get health access because they show up at a hospital and the hospital doesn't have any record of their existence and they can't treat them. And there are ways to do that with technology that makes it faster and easier than sort of the traditional way of having to go into a specific location and doing it, to cover more remote areas and so on and so forth. So lots of opportunities.
Yeah, no, so interesting. And I feel like it's one of those topics that I could literally talk about or listen to you talk about for far longer, but unfortunately that is all we have time for today. But Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insights, and just being so honest and open about all of the potential kind of opportunities there are for AI in the public sector. Really fascinating conversation, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Great questions. I appreciated it. It was a great conversation.
Perfect.